Hi, this is Chris at Highline Handmade Guitars, located in beautiful, sunny Colorado. You know, sometimes I feel like a nut, and sometimes I don't. But today I feel like a nut, which means I'm going to make a nut for this guitar. So, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the first step is to find a blank that will fit this guitar. I always carry a stock of different size bone blanks. That way, regardless of the guitar that I'm building, I am pretty confident I can find a blank in the assortment that I've got that'll fit that particular guitar. Oftentimes when I'm building a guitar, I'll plan for a specific sized shelf or slot for one of the nuts that I already have. That way I don't have to run the risk of not having something available and then having to order it, which can slow down the process. I use bone. This is just a piece of bleached white bone blank, and that's my favorite material. You can also use, there's a variety of other materials like graphite is really popular. There's brass, corian. I think you can get some exotic materials like buffalo horn and pre-ban ivory and things like that. The one bit of advice I can give you about buying a blank, especially a bone nut blank, is to make sure that it's real bone. I know, or at least I've heard some rumors about blanks coming out of different parts of the world that are actually bone dust that's been mixed with glue and compressed into a mold. So that's, to me, is just a recipe for disaster. So when you buy a blank, you want to make sure that you're buying it from a quality source. Also, I think it's really important, especially if you're doing nuts for the first time, to pick up a couple of blanks. There's a good chance that the first one you make is not going to be just exactly right. You may make the slots too deep. It may not fit properly, whatever. I think it's a good idea to have a couple of blanks so that, you know, in case something goes wrong, you can grab another blank and keep going. Once you've selected a blank, it needs to be sized to fit, and there's a couple of ways you can do it. This particular guitar, I have a shelf that the nut will sit on, so I can actually work on that shelf, get it perfectly flat and true from one side to the other. I can't work the face of this fretboard in here. The reason is because the distance from where the nut face will be to the center of the first fret is, you know, part of the scale length. So if I start to work down that wood, I'm shortening the scale length, and I don't want to do that. So an alternative is to actually work on the face and the bottom of the nut to get it to fit properly. Now, when I say fit properly, what I mean is you don't want the nut, when you set it down into the slot or onto the shelf, to tip or to rock. It has to lay down there and fit perfectly flush, and there can be no gaps. This is critical for getting great sustain. If there are gaps, you're not going to realize the guitar's full potential for sustain. So it's important to make sure everything fits and it doesn't move once it's in that position. A trick you can do is, if you're getting or having problems getting the fit and things are rocking or tipping or whatever, you can rub some pencil lead onto the bone blank, set it down, and then just gently slide it back and forth. And when you take it off, you'll see where the high spots are in the wood, and then you can take those down. And the tools that I like to use when working on this shelf are, I use a sharp 1/4-inch chisel, and you know, I can just work the wood that way. One of my favorite tools, though, is a Japanese Iwasaka file. Each of the teeth on this thing is like a razor sharp plane, and the nice thing is it has a ground smooth edge, so I can set that against my fretboard and just lightly work the area. The key here is, and this is true for the entire process of making the nut, it's gradual. We don't want to jump all the way to the finished size right off the bat. We want to gradually reduce the bone in the wood until we get the perfect fit. The reason is if you try to go too far too quickly, you can go too far too quickly, and the end result is you end up with a nut that's not going to work. The same is also true when we go to shape the nut. We're going to do this very gradually. We're going to start out big and then bring it in, and then once we get to the final shape, then we're ready to do the last bit of sanding and polishing. We don't want to mark it out and cut it exactly to shape right off the bat, because when you do that, you really run a risk of making a nut that's not going to fit properly. The strings will sit too close to the frets, and you'll have to start over. So now we're ready to go on to the next step, and that's to shape the nut. Okay, so the first step is to mark the boundaries of the nut's shape, and I like to use, it looks like just a regular pencil, but in truth it's been ground flat, so it's actually half a pencil, and this is really useful for getting in close. Now I'm just going to mark the outside edges, and that's really going to be more for reference at first. Then we lay the pencil down flat onto the fret wire right up to the edge, press it against the nut, and then we draw a line. What this line is going to represent is really the lowest point of the slot. If we were to actually make the slot go down to that and touch that line, our strings would touch the top of these frets. So we draw that line is just to give us a visual cue on where the lowest possible point will be for the strings, and then that way when we shape, we can actually make the shape of the nut about 1/16 of an inch taller, and I'll do the same on the sides, and then later on I'll gradually bring it down to the final size. So that's kind of what you get. So as you can see, the nut is quite a bit larger than it actually needs to be. But as I said before, we're going to start out big and then gradually make it smaller until the size is just right. Before we can continue on with fabricating the nut, we need to string the guitar. Here's a tip. After you string the guitar up and you clip off the excess string, don't throw those pieces away. Hold on to them. These make great string gauges for determining our action height, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But for now, our next step is to establish our string spread at the nut, and then we can start to form the slots. Now I'm ready to establish the string spacing on the nut, or the string spread. And I'm sure there's some mathematical formulas out there that people use that would take into account the exact gauge of each string and so on and so forth. But I find what works really well is just to use a Stuart McDonald string spacing ruler. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of how to use the ruler. If you buy one, it's got instructions on how to use it. But in my opinion, this is the best way to get started in getting your string spacing set, and then you can go back in and visually tweak it. But once I've got my string spacing set according to the ruler, I can then go back in and file a starter slot for each string. And what I do is I take a 10,000th nut slotting file, and then I just position it underneath where the string was originally positioned, and I just form a very shallow starter slot. And if you listen carefully, you can hear it pop into the slot. And I will do the same thing with each string. Once I'm done, I'll go back and I'll look at it visually and check to make sure that the spacing appears as accurate as the ruler was telling me. Sometimes because of different gauge strings, you might have to make some slight adjustments from what you got with the ruler, which will help you to get a more accurate positioning of the strings. For example, I'm finding that this one needs to move a little bit over and closer to the high E because it visually looked a little bit off. So I'll just move this over to the next slot, or to the new slot, and that looks much better. So at this stage, we're ready to proceed to the next step, which is to actually start forming our nut slots. These starter slots, as you can see, they're just right on the very top of the nut, but you know that's the kind of string action that can split open a finger no matter how thick your calluses are. I'm ready to cut the nut. What we're going to do is I'm going to cut each slot for each string, and I'm going to use my nut slotting files, and I've picked these up. I think most of these came from StewMac. If you don't have a set of nut slotting files and you're really intent on doing this, what you can do is go out and buy some feeler gauges from an auto parts store and then use a Dremel with a grinding disc and then cut teeth. Then you can use the appropriate size gauge to cut your slots. On the thicker ones you might have to sandwich a few together. Another thing you can do is, if you saved your wound strings, as I told you, you can actually use those, but that's a real cheeseball way of doing it. I really recommend you invest in a set of nut slotting files. So I'm going to start by doing the high E string, which is going to be a 10,000th of an inch slot, and we'll just start out gradually cutting. Now, because we're going to have to go fairly deep into the nut, it's a good idea to kind of, as you're working, kind of move the file side to side at an angle to keep it a little bit wider. This is where things get kind of complicated. When you're making these slots, the idea is to create a break point right at the front of the nut face where the string comes off and heads to the bridge. In a perfect world, at both the bridge and the nut, you would want to have a knife edge for the string to come off of. But this isn't practical because with a bone nut, a knife edge is going to wear down really quick. It's also going to cause problems with string breakage. So what we need is to have as narrow a contact patch as possible between the string and the nut, but we don't want it to be so sharp that it can cause us problems. So we have to find a happy medium. And for those of you out there who are experienced at doing a lot of guitar repairs, you probably have noticed there are times when you have a guitar with a string that sounds like a sitar. And oftentimes that's because there's way too much contact going on between the nut and the string. So what we need to do is we need to form the groove, form the slot, and then as we get to the final depth, we start to angle it down. And that way, as the string comes off the tuner, it comes up and touches the nut just at the very front of it before it leaves for the bridge. And along the sides, you want it to gradually work away from the string so that there isn't as much contact. The more contact there is, the more you lose sustain, the more the string starts to sound like a sitar. So hopefully I can show as I'm forming these that we're going to start out flat, but then we're going to kind of angle down, and then we're going to kind of work the sides so that it's there isn't an excessive amount of contact. But at the same time, we don't want the string to move around too much in the slot either. So this is one of those things that actually takes quite a bit of experience to get it exactly right. But if you understand the principles of how the slot in a nut should be formed, it's not that difficult to do it. So I've been sawing away here for a few minutes, and every so often I'll stop and drop the string back in to check to see how deep the slot is. One way that I like to check is to press down the string just behind the second fret and then tap it down to the first fret. And ideally what we want is just barely any clearance there. And right now there's still quite a bit, but I think at this stage I'm done with that first fret and now, or that first string, so now I can move on to the B string and start to lower that one down. Alright, well, the preliminary slots have been cut, and now the next step is to remove the nut, and I'm going to take it back to the belt sander, and I'm going to further refine the shape. Remember, this is a gradual process, so we're getting there. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to do as I shape this nut is I'm trying to, it's hard to see, but I'm trying to grind it down into a kind of a fall off towards the tuner side. And then that's really more for an aesthetic reason. And then I'll round off some of these edges so that they won't crack and chip away. But it's getting close. Of course, there's quite a bit of hand sanding involved, mostly on that top radius and then on these corners that I want to round over. Bone is somewhat brittle, and if you're not careful, your strings, your tools, can catch and crack off pieces, so you want to try to take down some of those sharper edges, make it nice and round it over. The bottom and the face of the nut have to be absolutely flat, so I take a piece of sandpaper and I put it on the table of my bandsaw, which has been, precision ground smooth and flat. So I'm still using 220. And that's about it. I'm going to come back here later and do the same thing again with a finer grip. But now what I need to do is go in and do the final slotting and get that to the depths that it needs to be and go from there. What I'm doing now is I'm fine-tuning the depth of the slot, and I'm starting out at the face end with the file level, and then I'm gradually angling it and pushing it down towards the end. And what that does is it creates a slot that will drop away from the string. We want most of the string to contact the bone at the very face of the nut. And then we want it to gradually fall away towards the back. And we want to try to reduce the area of contact along both sides. And the reason we do that is because when there's too much contact, it tends to mute the sustain in the string. Now, in case you're wondering, how do you know how deep to go with the slot? When are you finished deepening the slot? well, there's a couple of different ways. You can use a feeler gauge, but feeler gauges are kind of awkward to use because of their width. You know, it's sort of trying to get it underneath there and pressing the string down. It's not a bad way to do it, but I don't think it's as easy to do. Another way is there's a Stuart McDonald sells a gauge with a dial indicator on it that you can sit on top of there, and it'll actually tell you how high the string is. Problem with that is, it ain't cheap. What I do is when I clip off the ends of the strings after I've tuned or after I've strung up the guitar, I don't throw those pieces away. I keep them because we know that each one of these has a specific diameter that we're aware of. So what I do is for the E, B, and G string, I usually will go anywhere from 10/1000ths of an inch up to about 14/1000ths of an inch. So what I'll do is I'll take a string it's a 10 string, a 10/1000ths of an inch string, and I'll slide that right under along the center, and then just press that string. And if it's perfectly at the perfect depth, the string is going to be sitting right on top of my little scrap string. If it's still too high, you can see the string move up and down. So I'll just keep working these, and I'll do a 10/1000th for this string, probably a 12/1000th string for this one, and then a 14 for that one. Then on this string, I'll jump to about an 18, and then a 20, and then a 22. It doesn't have to be exactly perfectly on that, but fairly close, and everybody has a slightly different idea of what they think is good action here. But that's what I think is a general all-purpose action setting. For all intents and purposes, this nut is done. I could install it on the guitar right now, string up everything, and we'd be good to go. But that's just not good enough. We need to put a polish on this thing. So I've got 3 sheets of sandpaper here. I've already done 220, so I'm going to do 400, 600, 800, and at that point I can buff out a really nice shine. So, and it doesn't take much. We don't need to spend a lot of time on each grit. It's pretty fast. And we'll do that with each grit. Alright, so the final step now is going to be to buff it up to a nice glossy shine. Okay, this is the last step, I promise. We're going to glue the nut to the shelf. And I'm going to use just some gap filling CA glue, and I'm going to put a drop onto the shelf here. It doesn't take much, and you don't want to get it too close to the edge or it'll squeeze out, and this stuff is kind of messy. Now some people will say, super glue, why would you use super glue? Well, because it's super, and it's an easy product to work with. If you decide later on to get rid of or to take the nut off, it's just a matter of heating the nut a little bit, which breaks the bond of the super glue, and that's really all there is to it. Have a little bit of squeeze out there, but that's no big deal. Okay, now I'll just tighten down the strings, which will serve as clamping pressure for the nut. And then we are done.